Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. So today's video I'm going to be doing an introduction to feminism. I have quite a few texts here that I want to get through. So I'm going to try and be as quick as possible because I don't want this video to go on for absolutely ages. So yeah, I'm just going to kind of jump right into it. These are sort of I think there's about 8 texts that I think are great foundational and essential foundational texts of feminist texts, and I'm going to start off with 2 which I've already spoken a fair bit about in previous videos, so I'm going to link those previous videos below, and potentially any blog posts and stuff that I've written about them. So I'm going to keep these 2 short and sweet. So the first one is Angela Davis, Women, Race and Class. This is an intersectional feminist text. It was written kind of before intersectionality was coined as a term, in which Davis addresses the history of the women's rights, liberation, feminist movement in the US, but through the lens of race and class. So she talks about how race and class affected engagement with the feminist movement, and how the feminist movement in turn neglected race and class considerations, which made it unrepresentative and quite conservative with the small c, kind of folding into the current system rather than a radical revolutionary movement. It's a really key text that sort of outlines the historical experience of black women and working class women. And then secondly is, of course, Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici. This is a cult classic, absolute favourite of mine. Federici argues that the degradation of women's social position was necessary for the successful transition from feudalism to capitalism, and that this involved devaluing women's labour within the home, which was previously seen as an essential part of the household economy, whilst simultaneously barring women from wage labour and emphasising women's place in the home. As social reproduction was crucial to maintaining labour for capitalist growth. And here she views the witch trials not as a strange aberration, but a necessary part of terrorising and punishing women who refused new submissive, devalued roles in society. Next I'm going to look at a Bell Hooks' Ain't I a Woman. I insert picture here because I do not have a physical copy of it. I read a PDF copy, and this is another pre-intersectional feminism, intersectional feminist text. Reading it reminded me a lot of reading Women, Race and Class, which of course is always positive. And it explores the relationship between black women and feminism, particularly with sort of the historical negation of black women's womanhood and femininity under slavery. Also the racism or the unwillingness to acknowledge or ally with racialized people of the feminist movement, but also the sexism of black men, especially during the civil rights, black liberation movement, this kind of erasure of sexism as a problem and making racism the foremost problem, or the only problem, should I say, but also the myth of it addresses the myths of black families being matriarchies, and all of these things combined that she explores leads to, at least at the time that she's writing, which I believe is in the very early 80s, it leads to black women's rejection of feminism and their ardent belief in patriarchy, which, to be fair, when you've been denied sort of these privileges and protections that femininity bestowed on white women, I think it's understandable that you want to receive them too. But I think that's a really crucial text to sort of underline understanding the relationship between black women and feminism, and how it has historically been quite like abrasive. So then next up I have Lola Olufemi's Feminism Interrupted. This again is part of that Pluto Press Outspoken series. It's a radical feminist recentering of mainstream Western feminism. It advocates for a programme of justice and the dismantling and restructuring of society as like the cornerstone of intersectional feminism. Olufemi explores and challenges the interconnected web of sexism and racism, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, capitalism, etc., bringing to the foreground the very real material concerns of poor women, black women, religious minorities, racialised minorities, migrants, sex workers, aka all of those who have been left behind and sacrificed by the kind of very like tokenistic, superficial aims of white feminism. Olufemi asks us, how can we expect to achieve true equality for all without fully dismantling the system that has and continues to exploit and oppress us? Whilst capitalism remains, equality will always be a facade. So the next book I wanted to address is J.J. Bola's Mask Off. This is again part of that Outspoken by Pluto Press series. It's an introductory text, a very introductory text to masculinity and patriarchy, with emphasis of the intersectional, but the impact of intersectionality on these categories, should I say, and how masculinity and patriarchy works in different contexts, and how, particularly when masculinity becomes so rigid, it becomes toxic and harmful to men and to the people that men engage with. It's a really, really, really great book for beginners, particularly men. I think men are the target audience of the book. Bola shows like sympathy and highlights how personally destructive socialized hegemonic masculine behaviors can be, but he never seeks to like justify violence or play it down harmful behaviors and attitudes towards others. He explains the roots of these behaviors, whilst advocating for responsibility and accountability. It's definitely the perfect book to introduce and educate people on the invisibility and pervasiveness of patriarchy and toxic masculinity. And it also, he provides solutions, his 10 courses of action, to enact what he calls collective cultural and social transformation and a shift in consciousness. But it's definitely a book that is primarily targeted at men, and to introduce men to the ways that like patriarchy is like this double-edged sword that both benefits men but also harms men, and that it's in the best interest to work alongside women to dismantle patriarchy and also address masculinity and the toxicity of masculinity. So next up I have Melissa Gira Grant's Playing the Whore. I had to include a book about sex work and sex workers, because in my personal opinion, if your feminism isn't pro sex workers, then it's not really feminism. This doesn't necessarily mean that I'm like in favour of the sex work and the industry in and of itself, but it's kind of the recognition of the fact that personal opinion doesn't actually really matter. It's completely irrelevant. The industry exists, and sort of like no amount of moralising about it will change it. So Playing the Whore sort of outlines the necessity of viewing sex workers' work and viewing sex workers as workers, and in centering their voices and experiences in order to ensure that these, not just women, people, are working in safe conditions and that they are protected in their jobs just as we would do and expect for any other job and any other worker. Gira Grant also talks about the importance of not viewing sex workers as inherent victims, because this minimises the very real like violence and victimisation that sex workers can face on the job. It also minimises agency, which is crucial to sex work. But she also stresses the importance of not viewing sex workers as like empowered or their work as empowering. Because frankly, how many people in the world actually feel like their work empowers them? It's a very privileged thing to be able to experience, and unless we want to get into like a discussion of how all work under capitalism is inherently exploitative and disempowering, it's not really necessary to portray sex workers in that way. So yeah, I think this was like a really nice, coherent, clear, concise book on sex work and sex workers, and yeah, stressing the importance of really giving sex workers a voice within the feminist movement, because they're often kind of like either ignored or talked for in quite a patronising manner. The final book I want to talk about is Francoise Verges' A Decolonial Feminism. I was going to really go in on the French pronunciation then, and then I decided not to, and now I feel like such a cop-out. But anyway, this is a short but sweet, like part manifesto, part critique of mainstream civilization feminism, or what we would call white feminism. It advocates for a feminism that's anti-capitalist, anti-racist, anti-colonial and anti-imperialist, an intersectional feminism that addresses sexism, of course, but crucially addresses the systems that created and enabled and continue to create and enable sexism and all forms of oppression that people face globally. This is what Verges refers to as a decolonial feminism. It's a socialist, anti-racist, anti-colonial type of feminism. But Verges also stresses that a feminist cannot claim to possess the theory or the method, importantly noting that there's not one kind of radical feminism or one kind of a right approach to decolonial feminism, but rather it's more of a process and a collaboration between feminists globally. Her approach here is to introduce a kind of feminist theory that offers, and I quote, a multidimensional analysis of oppression and refuses to divide race, sexuality and class into mutually exclusive categories, whilst advocating for praxis that recognises these differences and intersections and allows for collective action to bring about global, structural, societal, cultural and economic changes. It's just a really great like bite-sized book manifesto that actually really asks a lot of profound questions and calls into question a lot of these institutions, and yeah, it's really kind of innovative. Why can't I say that? Definitely really groundbreaking, and as I said, really short and sweet. So that's everything. That's all the books that I have decided to pick today. I have picked, as you can see, some very like short and sweet books. I think all of the books that I've picked are like under 200 pages or like around 200 pages. Yeah, I think it's really important, like whilst I think it's really great to read like big chunky texts with a lot of detail and a lot of whilst I think it's really important to sort of read these like bigger texts that are maybe more in depth, I think definitely for a foundational knowledge there are so many books that are just definitely really short and sweet, made to be introductory texts, and that really create like a nice broad foundational knowledge, not just of feminism but of, because they're intersectional in nature, the ones that I've picked, for just a broad range of topics that means that they are useful in multiple different ways and contexts. But anyway, thank you for watching. I'm going to leave a bunch of links down below to my Bookstagram account and my blog and whatever else. I'd really appreciate it if you could like this video. I'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe if you haven't, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!